All right, so we have here Bob Walker, and I'll give a little bit of an introduction to Bob, and then I'll let him have the floor and talk. So I've known Bob for 6 or 7 years, ever since I started going to Smoky Point Community Church. Um, I have the honor of serving on the elder board with Bob, and Bob has been a member of the leadership at the church for many years, and um, professionally, he's been an engineer at Boeing for a long time as well, and has had a lot of leadership roles in Boeing as well. So, um, Bob, this is really about racism and what's been happening in our country, and putting personal stories out there. Um, and so, I'd kind of like to hear what some of your background is. Maybe share a little bit of your bio, and maybe even if you want to share about your parents or your grandparents, and then what ways that racism has impacted your life personally.
Okay. Oh, well, let's start with my upbringing. I was raised in the New Orleans, Louisiana area. We call that home base. My dad was a Methodist minister, so we lived across the South. He went to seminary in Atlanta, Georgia. I remember him graduating at that probably about 1955 or so. I was born in 1954, so that's not right. He must have gotten his degree like I was about 5 years old, and I remember him getting his degree. Um, and that may have been, I'll say at this time, that was his master's degree because
Oh.
his initial degree was in business.
Mm.
He went to Dillard University in New Orleans, which is a Methodist university, and that's where he met my mom. And they married in '52. They he then went to seminary. He had always been involved in the Methodist Church. Matter of fact, he was adopted, but his adopted parents were a pastor and a pastor's wife in the Methodist Church in New Orleans.
Hmm.
And so we traveled all over Louisiana, trying Bastrop, Louisiana, which is near Monroe, which is Duck Dynasty Center, right?
Yeah.
If you know those guys, up in that part near Shreveport. We stayed in Alexandria, Louisiana, which is central Louisiana. And then we finally made our way down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is home of LSU and Southern University, and then New Orleans. So, but most of my life that I remember growing up as a teenager was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Yeah.
All right, and I recall hearing about that quite a bit this year with LSU winning the national championship. I think that.
Absolutely.
Yep.
I wore my hat every day.
Yep. Congrats on that. So go ahead.
My mom was a professor at Southern University, which was a historically black university.
Mhm.
And it was 6 miles away from our home. And my dad's church was near the campus of Southern University. As a teenager, I went to Southern University Laboratory High School. This is where the student teachers for Southern University came and got their training. So most of the kids that went to school there were sons and daughters of professors on the campus, and we gave them heck. we gave the student teachers a run for their lives.
I bet.
When I graduated from high school, the last year of high school, my dad was transferred from Baton Rouge to a church in New Orleans, his hometown. And so we moved there when I was in 12th grade, and I ended my schooling my high school career at Warren Easton High School, which is right on Canal Street, downtown New Orleans, right? And it was a very interesting time. No, one of the things that was different about New Orleans is we didn't have school buses
Hmm.
like most areas today.
Hmm.
We all rode public transit,
Hmm.
and that's how we got to school, and that's how we learned how to ride the buses around the town. So, and everybody did that. So it was kind of universal. Most of southern Louisiana is at the time was Catholic,
Hmm.
inhabited by the Spanish and the French, and we all did the sign of the cross every time we passed the church.
Hmm.
You know, it was kind of like a cultural thing more than it was a church thing, right? So that's the kind of life I grew up
Okay.
in.
So you've been around the South and um, 50s and those times. That's kind of right in the textbooks when people are looking up civil
Yes,
rights movement and so forth. So,
absolutely.
what could you share about some personal things that you experienced growing up, or your parents maybe in dealing with racism?
So I think racism then is not the same as it is now, right?
Okay.
It was very different. It was much more harsh. It was a very segregated community, right? There were definitely areas where uh, blacks could not go. There were separate drinking fountains, bathrooms. Uh, you couldn't go to the food counter at certain department stores. If you could order food, you couldn't sit at the counters. You had to take your food and go outside and eat. And so there were clear lines of demarcation during that time frame of in terms of what was going on. I think uh, when I define racism, those are the kind of systemic things that I think we were trying to overcome at the time.
Mhm.
Right. I
So
think the
go ahead.
yeah, I think the conversation today is a bit different. You know, we don't have those kind of systemic things, and now the conversation has really turned to the definition of racism meaning something else, and
Okay.
what that something else is, I haven't really come to understand in the same context as
Okay.
maybe my younger generations.
So how would you define racism?
I would define it as um, that that mechanism that was through society, through law, that kept one segment of people out of the community.
Hmm.
Uh, and I've seen it in different ways. Even I came to the Northwest in 1979. I moved to Marysville in 1985. I saw it not so much as a uh, reflection of me, but it was more towards Native Americans
Mm.
from the culture that was in this area,
Mm.
and the way they thought and talked about the Native Americans that are around here.
Okay.
And
Um,
even that has changed.
right. Yeah. Interesting. That was the same group that I had another guest that I just talked with, and in Canada actually, And he
Uh-huh.
said that is the group that he think has borne the brunt of most of the racism that he's seen overtly in modern times. So interesting to hear that perspective. I also think it's interesting you talked about the changing definition of the term racism. Do you think that plays into some of the conflict that we're having today, and maybe the not understanding each other when you have a word that has been defined as a certain you look in the dictionaries and they all may define it the same way and talk about prejudice and one group thinking they're superior to another, and then when the definition starts to change, does that complicate things, do you think? And should we be changing definitions or maybe creating a different word?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a problem with this changing definitions, but what I can't get is a clear answer on what that new definition is.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in conversations I'm having with my friends and family, especially the younger generation, some of what's going on is, for instance, there's a book series that's out called The Color of Compromise.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see some of the episodes from that book on Amazon Prime if you have it. And they go back and they study the history of the church being complicit in racism.
Mm.
Well, that's true, but this is one guy's thesis, and he really doesn't talk about the elements of the church that were against it. He only talks about the elements that were in on the compromise.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and there were many people against it, right? And so it's hard for me to get across to him or to them that the shackles of slavery didn't come undone by Black people alone,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's a lot of whites died for that right that you have, and they're not. I think we've not done a real good job telling the story, the story of the history of the country, and keeping parts of it out of the classrooms and whatever. Because if they had known that, this is like it's a new revelation to them, and they're taking it and running with it, and that is problematic in that we've also, previous generations have recognized that and said, we've come past that. And now we're here. And yes, you can look at the history, but the history isn't today. It's back 40, 50, 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. And they're just seeing it for the first time, and they think it's right now. Mm-hmm. Right? It's happening now. Yeah. We've come way past that.
Okay. Awesome. Let's see. You mentioned the church and the fact that they have been complicit. People under the heading of the church have been complicit in some parts of slavery or.
And understand, I don't like that term.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll let you put in a term that you like better, maybe to explain that. But so there's a past where there's bad and good people in the church that stood up to fight to stop slavery and so forth as well.
Right.
What do you see being an elder in the church? What do you see as what should the Christian church do today? What role should they take in, with what's happening today? There's all this momentum and there's all this attention that's going there. Should the church play a role, and if so, what should it be?
Yeah, I think the church always has a role in reconciliation, right? We reconcile ourselves to God, and we reconcile ourselves to each other. And if we have to do that, uh, you know, that's what Promise Keepers back in the 1990s was about. It was about racial reconciliation. If we have to do that again, or to make it more prominent in the church, okay, that's fine. That may be necessary for some of the people that are in the generation of today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they have not felt that. Uh, but I think the other thing that we're trying to do is we, you know, Martin Luther King, one of the things he said was that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated time of the week.
Mm-hmm.
It's the most segregated hour. We need to kind of not do that anymore and figure out ways to work with our brothers and sisters. And I can tell you personally, that's why my wife and I don't go to an all-black church.
Mm-hmm.
We were raised in that community, and we decided when we came to the Northwest is that we had to seek a different culture and do things very differently. And so when we came here in 1979, we started going to First United Methodist Church in Everett. It's no longer there. It was on 36 in Colby. It's now Cocoon House. But we were the only black couple there. Our daughters were born there back in the 80s, mid 80s. Um, we had deep friendships with people in that congregation. I became the lay leader of that congregation, you know, and I, I think we can get over that by stepping out and around our sometimes perceived boundaries, sometimes the real boundaries that we have,
Mm-hmm.
and walk differently than we have been. I think that's what we really need to do.
So let me ask, did
Yeah.
you feel your wife and you, when you first started to go to church and you were the only black couple, were you out of your comfort zone?
Um, I would say no.
No? Okay.
And I will tell you why. Uh, before I left New Orleans, I was still going to church in my dad's Methodist congregation there. He had one of the largest Methodist churches black Methodist churches in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
I worked at a NASA facility, right? That was 99.9% Caucasian,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I enjoyed the friendship of people from all over the South, all over the country, designing tools and assembly jigs for the space shuttle program, and working with them and learning from them and having them being taught by me.
Mm-hmm.
And we associated on a personal level after work. Um, one of the young men that came in there, who was my age, he was 22, so was I. We learned to fly airplanes together. He was an instructor. I learned to fly,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we had all of our social aspects of our life became centered around those people I worked with. So when we came to the Northwest, part of that move was encouraged by many of those folks who worked in that facility in New Orleans, who came from the Northwest and said, you should go to Seattle, you would enjoy it. And so we did, we came, and we had no feelings about no hesitancies about coming here and enjoying the Northwest. I will tell you that my grandmother would always call and say, "Do you feel comfortable there? Are you ready to come back home?" You know,
Yeah.
that was her. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's really encouraging to hear. Um, so let me ask you about a couple of more things. What do you think? I think I probably know your answer, but I want to hear it. Talking about knowing the history of both sides. What do you think about tearing down statues and all the different things that are happening right now?
Um, so the way it's happening now, I don't agree with. I think if if a city decides they want to take statues down, that's fine. I don't believe in the anarchy
Mhm.
type process that's being used to destroy the statues. There's a history there. There's a history, and maybe they belong in a museum. Uh, but I don't think that history should be. That history says how it was, and how it also says how it should not be, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And both, if you lose that lesson, you're going to repeat this. And so you have to figure out there's probably a, a fine line to walk there in terms of taking down those structures and putting the right story behind them.
Mm.
This is who General Robert E. Lee was, and why uh, there's a statue to him,
Mm.
but also what's the wrong side of that story that needs to be told
Right.
also.
Right.
It's just not right. So many of us don't know why the statues are there,
Right.
and for some reason, some of those, there was a good reason to put them up, and we've lost that reason.
Hmm. Yeah. Awesome.
So
Thank you.
yeah.
Um, how about ideas that you would like to see, whether it's from legislatures or the community, or uh, what would you just like from people to do to improve race relations now?
Stop talking about it.
Mm.
I think that as long as I think I'm different than you, then we're always going to have a problem,
Mm.
right? And Bob and Dan aren't on the same page,
Mhm.
and we're more alike than many want to admit.
Mm.
And that's where the conversation has changed in the society, where we're talking about financial equity, uh, reparations, all those kind of things to get the Black community caught up with other communities. I, I'm not sure that those things are helpful. We now all have the same advantages. We all have the same footing. What are you going to do with it now that when you have freedom, and we've been given freedom, you're responsible. You're responsible to do something with that.
Mm.
You can't sit back and say, it wasn't given to me.
Mm.
No, it's you're free. You have to go get it. You have to decide what you're going to do with your life, and that will make a difference.
Okay. Personal responsibility. Um,
Yes.
okay. Great. Um, do you have a mentor, somebody in your life that has really mentored you?
Uh, Actually, I don't know. Probably we're co-mentors.
Hmm.
I had a gentleman. who just retired from the Boeing company, so we don't see each other as frequently as we used to. His name was Frank Wong, W-O-N-G,
Mm.
a Chinese American, second generation Chinese American who also, came up through the aerospace industry,
Mm.
but a devout Christian. And he and I had lots of conversations along these lines, and you know, intermingled our conversations and stories about our families and that kind of thing, and encouraged and prayed for one another.
Mm.
So I would say that's probably the longest standing relationship of that kind. But there have been many, many others,
Mm.
certainly the elders at Smoky Point Community Church, the pastors and elders there. I've had many, many friends that have mentored me over the years. Some of them were related to work, some of them were related to church, some of them were just social. Right.
Awesome. You mentioned that Bob and Dan have a lot more in common than we have that are different, right?
Yeah.
So as I started this series, I was quite open with my Christian faith, and um, as Christians, we get to say that we are brothers in Christ,
Absolutely.
and so because of the blood of Christ, essentially we're blood brothers, right? And
Absolutely.
so I think that's pretty cool, and I am far closer to and more closely related to you than
Many others.
than millions of
Yes.
white people, right? So
Yes. Absolutely.
I love being able to call you my brother.
Yeah. I love it too, Dan.
Yeah. Let's.
I've been thinking along one of my favorite pastors is a gentleman by the name of Vodie, Vodie Baucham.
Mm-hmm.
And Vodie Baucham is a pastor. He was a pastor in Dallas, Texas, and now since then he's left and gone to Africa. But he's got a couple of YouTube videos that are interesting to listen to at this time, even though they were recorded earlier.
Mm.
And one of them is on the racial reconciliation process that's in Ephesians chapter 2, and what we need to go through, and what you just talked about, Dan, us being more closely related than even your blood brothers.
Mm-hmm.
That is very true. Brothers in Christ, we are.
Awesome. So you mentioned some videos. If you can shoot me a message later, if there's certain resources that you would like to share, I will include those as links in the description of the video. So whether it's the videos from Vodie, or if there's books or articles or anything else that you would like to share that you just think is really important, send them to me and I'll include them in the link there. So
okay, we'll do.
Last question, and then if you have anything else that you just want to add at the end of that, I'll let you close it out. So what gives you the most hope for the future?
I think that our hope is in the Lord, right? That gives me the most hope for the future. We have, and we serve, we are loved by someone who has already conquered what we're trying to get through. That gives me the most hope.
Awesome. Any last things that you want to address?
No, I will always be here. I'm open to your audience that you're sharing with this with. If any of them want to feel like they want to contact me, I would be open to that as well. and we
Awesome.
can further carry on the conversation.
Great. Well, I appreciate your time, Bob, and it's been great talking to my brother.
Yep. Same to you, Dan.
All right. Thank you.
Love you, man.
Love you too.
All right. Have a good night.
You too.